Welcome to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakups podcast with your host, AJ Mahari. This podcast will give you an in-depth understanding of borderline personality disorder, whether you have it or a loved one, partner, ex, friend, adult child, or sibling of someone with borderline personality disorder. AJ Mahari is a counselor and trauma recovery coach who has 30 years experience working with those surviving borderline personality relationship breakups in all relationship types, healing from codependency, inner child healing, family of origin healing, and self-differentiation, narcissistic abuse recovery, and much more. Keeping it real to help you heal. Abuse is not love. You can find this podcast at ajmahari.ca, where you can also purchase and book sessions with AJ Mahari. Please also subscribe to AJ Mahari's YouTube channel at youtube.com/AJ Mahari.
This is a response to a comment on the video I did, Borderline Competition, Codependent, quote, "You had me at hello," unquote. Commenter says, "Do you have any views in attachment theory versus codependency? I recently read the book Attached. The authors don't agree with codependency per se, and they state that in a relationship, two people become one physiological unit." Well, my humble opinion is that's describing codependency right there. Anyway, and then the commenter continues, and that is supposed to be like that. And the commenter says the idea is both people work on their attachment style. That's a lovely thought. Except if you're dealing with somebody with BPD or NPD, then it's not even germane or relevant. It will get people into more trouble than it's worth. But the commenter continues, I'm only just getting into this whole field, but I feel this approach is quite blinkered. I would agree with that. And that if you really want to work on yourself, one should be aware of attachment styles theory and should also work on any codependency traits. Apologies if this doesn't make too much sense. I'm just learning. Many thanks. Well, it's come up recently on the channel a few times, interestingly enough, that people with codependency, and make no mistake about it, codependency is a real thing. Codependency is its own trauma response. So this has been coming up on my YouTube channel, like I said, and this comment is from my YouTube channel that I just read. I've read the book Attached. It's a fine book about attachment. There's Bowlby's attachment theory. There's all kinds of, Mary Ainsworth studied attachment in, quote, The Strange Situation. There are many things about attachment theory that can help people out. But here's what I would say. So I don't agree with the statement in the comment that said, the author, so if the authors of the book who wrote, Attached, the book Attached, don't agree with codependency per se, okay, fine, because you know what? Across the disciplines, across mental health, across all areas to do with human interaction, relationships, bonding, love, lack of, abuse, etc., there is certainly not any binding agreement among many. So many people. So the fact that the authors of that book have a way of looking at it through the lens of attachment theory and attachment, okay, good. But there's still codependency. That's my opinion. And then that the commenter said that they state in the book, these authors say that in a relationship, two people become one physiological unit. Well, no. Because I don't know what they meant by that, but one would assume if they knew what they were talking about, the idea is that each person would learn about their own attachment style, and then each person would be able to work on that, right? Whether in therapy or however one needs to work that out. But if one person has borderline personality, or one person has narcissistic personality, and even people with the issues and trauma of codependency, the attachment style has something to do with all of this, of course, and the lack of attachment, and what is a trauma bond. But the point is, it's not going to help people who are just in a relationship with someone with BPD or NPD right now, getting out of a relationship with somebody with BPD specifically, ghosted by somebody, a recent BPDX, you have a relative, it's just not going to help you to focus to start with attachment. the idea that two people become one physiological unit, to me, the only way I could see that as having any validity is to say it's not really true. And that in the healthiest of relationships, it's two interdependent people coming together to form interdependence. That's still not becoming one psychological unit. But, to each to their own with that. And it's supposed to be like that. No, I don't agree with that. Because maybe it's supposed to be like that in a symbiotic, healthy, secure attachment with mother in childhood, sure. But after that, I don't think so. And then, yes, the idea is that both people work on their attachment style. Well, good luck with that with somebody with untreated borderline personality disorder. Because they have what's known as a disorganized attachment style, which I would argue is not an attachment style at all. And when you say it's quite blinkered, I'm not sure what you're saying, because you're saying you're getting into the field, so you must think it has a lot of validity. And that if you really, the commenter said, if you really want to work on yourself, one should be aware of attachment styles theory and should work on codependency traits. Yeah, but you know what? When you're traumatized and you've been victimized and abused and traumatized in a relationship with somebody with BPD, and that's where you need to start your healing and recovery journey from, attachment style would be, deeper into the process of this healing and recovery, and healing and recovering from family of origin, inner child work, all of these other things I've talked about extensively on my YouTube channel. But the point is, you don't start with your attachment style if you're codependent and you're just fresh out of a cluster B relationship. You're the ex of a BPD or NPD. No, it's like in my experience anyways, like if you wanted to take what this commenter said, and if you want to take what the book says, because see, the book is not talking about the attachment trauma of borderline personality disorder. So if you want to try to think that you can do this for yourself, number one, that it's the first thing you need to do, or that down the road in the therapy process, healing from the relationship with the borderline ex, healing from that trauma bond, healing often for people with codependency and original trauma bond, which yes involves what happened in the attachment process for many people with codependency, but that's work that takes place in the codependency recovery and the relationship recovery when you've been with a person with BPD or NPD. And there isn't any, be my opinion anyways, you can't work, couples counseling with somebody with BPD, never mind somebody with NPD does not work, because people with BPD need their own therapy and their own treatment and their own healing and their own recovery. And people who are the exes, etc., or if you're still trying to make the relationship work, couples counseling doesn't even work. So how would this be, the coming together, working on the attachment styles? Well, this can help people in various areas of the recovery processes from things, yes. And people with BPD are going to have an elongated journey to even get to that point in healing and recovery for treatment for BPD. But so too will people with codependency have a rather longer journey toward when you're working at the point of attachment style, because you first need to get over the trauma of the relationship, etc. And so the idea that you could do this with a cluster B, you can't. You just simply can't, because they can't do it. So you could do it for yourself in your own therapy and recovery from a relationship with a borderline ex, and in working on codependency. And codependency is more than just quote traits. That's the way we're left defining it. But codependency, make no mistake about it, probably going to be pathologized as a personality disorder coming soon. But what codependency is right now is not just a set of traits, it's a trauma response. And I've had 31 years of experience working with clients, and I'm out here to work with you if you resonate with me. But I can just tell people right now that if you start with attachment theory as your modality or idea of how you're going to work toward recovery, or how you're going to rescue, change, fix the borderline with you in a process called let's both look at our attachment styles, I'm sorry, you're just in for a world of hurt, because that's not where that's most applicable to know more about, even for yourself. Yes, of course, in your own healing, recovery journey, and therapy, but you don't start there. You have to start where the codependency began. You have to start with what is varying degrees of actually maybe some kind of adverse bonding with a parent with codependency, but it's not necessarily that that's the biggest issue. Because people with codependency, I think it's pretty accurate to say, get through early childhood development, the stages of early childhood development, without a significant or as big a wound, or a primal wound, like what happens to people who are diagnosed with BPD and NPD. It's primal wounding, and it is about often trauma bonding, because trauma bonding can equal when there's no bond. So for people with BPD and those with NPD that will seek treatment, because there are various gradations within narcissistic personality disorder, they're not all the same either. But the bottom line is, people with BPD, or if a person with NPD, or fragile or vulnerable narcissist type is going to get into therapy, there's so much work to do for them, and there's so much work to do for the codependent, for the non-borderline in these relationships and coming out of them, that you need to do way before you get to the attachment style issue. Because the attachment style, yes, it matters for people with codependency, but it's not as inherent in what then goes on to happen through childhood. That is, the definition of the trauma of that creates codependency in childhood. So it's interesting that this has been brought up on my YouTube channel a few times recently in different ways, because the way I work with clients anyways, we definitely don't start with your attachment style, because there's healing from the relationship. There's what's coming to your consciousness from your childhood that is the trauma response known as codependency. And that is not just about attachment style. The woundedness and or the trauma that causes codependency in childhood is usually, in most people's cases, after early childhood development. It's a little bit after. So, but after the age of 5 or beyond. Apologize for the puppy here. I guess another important point to include here would be anxious and avoidant attachment styles can look like codependency in relationships. But who's to say, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So, are you codependent because you have an anxious or avoidant attachment style? I think rather that a lot of people with codependency do have an anxious or avoidant attachment style. Okay, so that's part of it. But it's not what gets you into the trauma bond. It's not at the level of attachment. It's the idealization and other needs. And then it might go down to that level. So to do with attachment, you could say, well, it's characterized like the feelings and behavior of pursuers and distancers. And so each one is unconscious of their needs, which are expressed by the other. But in a relationship with somebody with BPD, with somebody with codependency, and what that really means, this is not a dance caused by attachment styles. It's more the dynamic between the codependent and the untreated borderline specifically is a trauma bond reenactment from the unconscious of childhood trauma for the person with BPD and the person with codependency, but it's not the exact same trauma, and it doesn't manifest the same way. So people with codependency become pursuers, and people with BPD are maybe not really clearly pursuers, but they're more like pursue and distance, pursue, distance. It's more disorganized. And so this isn't really to do with the level of attachment style in terms of what comes to the consciousness of the person with codependency after the BPD relationship breakup, that then it has mirrored your experience of something in your childhood that was the trauma, the woundedness, that created the codependency in the first place, that led you to have the voracious emotional hunger that the idealization of the borderline just pulled you into. Because Because clients say to me so often, but I never felt that in my life before. I never felt that good before. And what happens is people with codependency, never mind your attachment style right now, you're trying to get back to that good feeling. And so this has a lot to do with really what codependency is, BPD, how they have an overlap of similarity, but it's not exactly the same. It's not going to manifest the same, but people with BPD externalize out needs and confuse it with love, their needs with love, and people with codependency externalizing out enabling, rescuing, trying to fix, being the hero, because I gotta do something to earn love. I gotta do something. I gotta pursue, because that's what happens in childhood, usually not primal or early stage development, but that's what happens in childhood with an emotionally unavailable parent or intermittent reinforcement. Whatever happens, it creates codependency for people, which is not the same core primal trauma as what creates BPD. And yet they have these overlapping similarities in areas. And so the distancer or the pursuer kind of pattern, kind of dyad in this trauma bond between the borderline and the codependent is not really based on so obviously, or it's not really that the attachment style is in play per se, though it is something to do with the codependence attachment style and the fact that the borderline can attach. So, and it's replicating something from childhood for the codependent that pursues the person with BPD. Why is there a pattern of pursuing the emotionally unavailable and in an unconscious way pursuing a relationship, a relational nightmare impossibility on the part of the person with codependence, while the person with untreated BPD is in the hell of the approach avoidance conflict, and they can't attach. So this pursuer distancer is not always it. Yes, it goes underpinningly in both directions, the borderline and the codependent. Lack of attachment in the case of BPD, disorganized attachment, which really isn't an attachment style, and it has something maybe well to do with a person with codependency's attachment style, but that never really comes to the fore in this relational dynamic of the trauma bond between the codependent and the borderline, because you don't ever get the intimacy or from the borderline. The borderline does not receive your love, and the borderline does not give you the love. And so people with codependency rather remain in the pursuer role, and more often than not, the borderline is going to be in the distancer role. So it's not all encompassed by the attachment style. Could be driven by that underneath a whole lot of other things in between, but they're not. The attachment style itself is not central when you consider the trauma bond between the untreated borderline and the codependent, because no matter whether the codependent is aware of their attachment issues, like I said, not going to come up in the relationship. Going to come up after the breakup and what you're struggling with partially? Absolutely. But for the person with BPD, there is no attachment style, more or less, to have them, when they pursue, when they hoover, it's still not about them looking for attachment, and not in any conscious way. Though you could say the underpinning of their trauma bond in childhood, of their lack of the arrested emotional development, of the lack of attachment, is playing into that. But there is no way in this trauma bonded dynamic and dyad between the borderline and the codependent to go somewhere and address each your attachment styles and then the relationship works out. No. That's totally off the table. In your therapy and healing and recovery from codependency and the ex with BPD, etc., the relationship breakup, it's very important to get to work around your attachment style. But there's other core trauma to deal with before that, and that needs to be dealt with. That's what I would assert. And the other thing here is, so what is attachment theory? Attachment theory relates to the emotional bond that connects an infant to the main person taking care of them, right? Usually mother. And the way that the mother reacts to the behavior and the needs of their child is of utmost importance, because it determines whether the child will be able to count on the mother or the object other, and first object other is mother. Freud said the first love object is mother. And so whether or not the child feels safe and comfortable with a mother. So in secure attachment, the mother is direct, sensitive, consistent, and supportive. The child feels safe, confident enough to explore their surroundings. They start having faith in their abilities. Children learn how to be resilient with a very present mother who's meeting your needs. And children learn how to be independent. So in avoidant attachment, mother can be distant, inactive, dismissive, critical, irritable, or eager to punish. And let's just say way stressed out. And the child then feels rejected. And the child can feel shame. And then as Bradshaw says, when a child feels shame or anger from a parent, especially in the infancy, early toddler stages of early childhood development, then it gets set aside outside of self because a child has nowhere to put that. And a child will suffer from emotional isolation and they feel stressed and scared. So belonging needs aren't met and a variety of other things like security, feeling emotionally safe. In avoidant attachment, those needs aren't met. And then there's ambivalent attachment. Mother is inconsistent, often indifferent, often sensitive. So this could be the intermittent reinforcement kind of situation with mother and child. And so the child feels stressed and insecure, angry, and a child experiences emotional abandonment, and they can't control their impulsivity because this is the mother. That ambivalent attachment is going to be the intermittent reinforcer if you get reinforcement at all and what you need. They can become less sociable and more aggressive. And none of these are the underpinning reasons of how codependents end up in relationships with cluster Bs. And then there's disorganized attachment. There's often only referred to, maybe some people break it down more, 3 main attachment styles: secure, avoidant attachment, ambivalent attachment. Then there's anxious, avoidant. It breaks down further. So people with the trauma response known as codependency do not have secure attachment, and nor do people with BPD or NPD, obviously, right? So people with BPD and NPD, they have disorganized attachment, which is a really kind way of putting it, actually, because really they don't know how to attach. So in this disorganized attachment, the mother can be exaggerating things, and maybe like histrionic, for example, but have BPD, for another example, or be narcissistic. Mother is unpredictable. Mother creates a lot of fear in the child. Mother could be a drug addict. Mother could have a mental health disorder, like I said, BPD or NPD or other, schizophrenia, just things that make it so that the mother is not really meeting the child's needs and there isn't a healthy bond forming. So disorganized attachment, which is usually associated with borderline personality, or we could say narcissistic personality disorder too, but it's not usually going to be the person with codependency. And so in disorganized attachment, a child feels very scared, very sad. They may well approach strangers looking for emotional safety because they're lacking emotional safety from the mother, at least, if not both parents, but results in really extreme low self-esteem and lack of self-worth, shame wounds, and it can lead either to passivity, extreme passivity, or an extremely aggressive kind of relational style. But the thing about disorganized attachment that I really want to drive home here in the context of the topic area that I'm dealing with and where I work with clients in healing and recovery, people with BPD or people who've been traumatized and hurt by somebody with BPD, is that disorganized attachment specifies and relates directly to borderline personality and to a lesser degree, I guess, but it's, an overlap into narcissistic personality disorder. People without one of those two diagnoses aren't usually going to be reflective of a disorganized attachment. Can't rule it out that somebody with codependency could have a disorganized attachment, but I don't think so because it was added in to the attachment styles mainly through the lens of like borderline personality, and what is that attachment trauma? Because the disorganized attachment is when it's at a level of just severe attachment trauma. And that means there's going to be an absence of attachment, which is really going to be the first trauma bond. And that really does usually end up in a person with borderline personality or narcissistic personality, not codependency. So people, I mean, there's various different views on this for sure, but I think that it could be important in one's healing or recovery, and it will become important when somebody with BPD gets a lot of treatment as well. But it's not for codependence. It's not the place to start in your healing and recovery journey after a relationship with somebody with BPD or NPD. I'm not going to get into, and if you were raised by a parent with BPD or NPD also, because that's where there could be that overlap, as there's a big overlap between borderline personality and codependency. Then in the middle of that overlap for somebody with codependency, but a resilient enough temperament to not have BPD, but have a lot of woundedness, have a trauma bond, have an attachment style that is going to be part and parcel of why you end up in a relationship with a cluster B. It's not at the forefront of why. It's sort of the underpinning of why. And I find working with clients in therapy that many don't even address their attachment style because while it might not be secure, it's really not the biggest underpinning issue of how you got into the relationship with a cluster B and what do you need to heal now. For some people, they do take their healing and recovery journey when I work with clients to that depth. But that's usually after a lot of work in the process, family of origin, inner child work, healing from the relationship with the borderline, etc., working through a lot of the issues that it goes back to. And then, yes, underneath all that, and when people are turning the corner, so to speak, to work on what they need to know more about themselves going forward, yes, attachment style is important to then look at and know more about. But it's not the other way around. And there is no conventional wisdom in anything that I've ever studied, or even in working with clients for 30 years, the theories, all the books I've read on many things, including attachment and other things. But you see, it's like imago therapy. There's like so many different things out there and people will talk about relationships, or they'll talk about attachment, or they'll talk about this and that, but they're not at all thinking about borderline personality or narcissistic personality. They're not thinking about the cluster B area of what happens in that chaos, called, quote, relationship. The impossibility of these relationships. And I don't like to use a word like unique in this situation, but the unique agony and difficulty with a trauma-bonded addiction and all the other moving pieces of how people are shattered and traumatized, and in the fear, obligation, guilt, confusion of the cognitive dissonance and the rumination and I want that person back. I want the feelings that got an idealization, but I can't believe this wasn't real. This is all trauma that people with codependency to one degree or another have experienced snippets of, if not more, in childhood. So it's like it's like a re-traumatization. And what's important to know about this is people with BPD or NPD cannot go, even if they're willing, to therapy to address the same thing as the codependent needs to address in their therapy. It doesn't work that way. You can't save a relationship with a borderline by trying to figure out, well, they have disorganized attachment. Just ipso facto, that's known. And then whatever your attachment style is. No, and this idea of attachment that you're to become one physiological or psychological, one unit, no, that flies in the face of a lot of other, not only theories and studies and modalities and models and books, but it flies against the idea that healthy love comes from two independent people coming into interdependence together. It's not merging, it's not enmeshing, it's not two becoming one at all. It is a healthy relationship in which two people come together and have mutuality, reciprocity, respect, etc. But they do not mold and meld into each other. So, anyway, I think I've more than made my point on this, that attachment theory, or well, never mind the theory, but attachment, knowing your attachment style. I am not of the opinion that the commenter mentioned that the book Attached, and I remember I read it, but I can't, it's been a while. I can't recall it all right now. But that the commenter said this idea that you're supposed to come together in one physiological unit. Well, there's a plethora of other material out there and other, disciplines and ways that say absolutely no, because that's not what healthy relationships are about. So I wonder if the commenter took, and I don't know, took something that was described as what's needed for, healthy, symbiotic, secure attachment in toddlerhood. But that's not how healthy relationships are formed between two individuals that are relatively mentally healthy, right? So when you've been with a cluster B, the last thing on your mind right now, if you're in the beginning stages of, what happened, what's going on, or you just found out maybe they have BPD, or you suspect they have BPD or NPD, then I would advocate for people, as this is what I've seen clients presenting with for 30 years, and this is my 31st year working with clients. I would advocate that that is not the place to start in healing, and that if attachment theorists or the authors of the book Attachment, who may well be attachment, like ascribe to Bowlby's attachment theory or different, attachment theory, or just generally that's wonderful. But then if they want to push codependency aside, well, codependency is like a football to a degree, right? It's not an official diagnosis. And so one mental health professional or area like attachment theorists or people that really are focused on that, and maybe helping people to change their attachment styles to help them in better relating, yes, great, wonderful, but it has nothing to do with relating to a cluster B. And you're not going to drag them along the journey, and it's not going to help them because they need so much other therapy first. But I don't think that all the focus in the world on attachment, they have that opinion, as the commenter said, apparently, but it does not push codependency out of the picture, because codependency is established in very many other areas of what happens in childhood. And may I stress again, not usually the developmental early childhood. Can be that too, but for many people with codependency, the seeds of codependency and what's happening, what's really wounding the then child, so you have a wounded inner child now, usually happens like after, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, or beyond that. So it's not going to fit into disorganized attachment. It's not going to be the primal trauma that is BPD and NPD, like respectively. I would just advise, like, people do whatever they want, pursue whatever you want, but it's going to be more helpful to not be pursuing your attachment style first and foremostly when you just got out of a BPD relationship breakup, and or if you have a BPD or a narcissistic parent, because codependency, I think, is established enough. I mean, the American Psychiatric Association doesn't talk about it. An argument was made, or arguments have been made to create, or classification of codependent personality disorder. The argument began in 1986, and the reason why it has never been in the not that I'm a fan of the DSM-5 or the DSM at all, but why it hasn't been included up till now has been the way that they sort of, quote, rationalize a lot of things, unquote, for the better or the worse, in the APA, is that codependency overlaps too closely to borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder. So you can already see where and there are overlaps for people that don't have a cluster B diagnosis and have codependency. The overlaps to two personality disorders are significant, and are significant enough, I would argue or advocate, significant enough that the attachment, well, the book Attachment, but people that ascribe more to attachment theory, attachment at the base of how people relate, which isn't incorrect. But when you're dealing with cluster B or something like dependent personality disorder, and the overlap between BPD, dependent personality disorder, with codependency in the middle, they're overlapping with both of them, suggests to me that you can't just argue codependency away by saying, well, I just have anxious avoidant attachment, and that's what that is. So obviously people are saying that out there. Professionals are saying that. I take it, maybe, I can't remember, the authors of the book may well be mental health professionals. But in my 30 years worth and going into my 31st year of experience with working with clients in these healing and recovery journeys from the relationship with somebody with BPD or NPD and or a BPD or NPD parent, but really the trauma response that is codependency, which is still kind of a generous way to put it, because it does have strong overlaps with two personality disorders, if that's the way we want to use this language, right? I don't believe codependency can be set aside or obliterated by what your attachment style is. Because for so many people with codependency, it's really not about early childhood. It's not about the attachment. Could there be somebody with codependency with secure attachment? I think it's possible, because it's about the woundedness of later. It's about what's happening. So maybe not, but I don't know, but I wouldn't rule it out. So again, I would just caution people, if you're going to be thinking about your attachment style, and then you're going to think about the borderlines attachment, please, save yourself the agony and the tripling down on your trauma of trying to go there. In your own healing and recovery process, at some point after a lot of other moving pieces of the healing journey from these relationships and from codependency, I think then yes. And I've worked with clients and we talk about attachment style and we do some work on changing anxious avoidant attachment or the other kinds of things, ambivalent attachment. Yes, definitely. But that's not where you start in coming out of these relationships. So it's underpinning to degrees, yes, in various degrees for different people. But there's so much other trauma on top of that. So it's like you work your way down to that. And what I find with clients is by the time we get to their attachment style and those kind of issues, they've already done a lot of the other work: family of origin, inner child healing, working on the self-differentiation, the healing and recovery from the borderline ex and the trauma of that relationship. And then maybe it's time to talk about the attachment style of a person in recovery from codependency, etc. Because going forward, yes, there's work that it will benefit people to do to be able to come to develop a more secure attachment style and to deal with the issues of whatever attachment style fits for a person who's already in therapy for codependency and because they were with somebody with BPD or NPD or comorbid BPD, NPD. So again, attachment isn't the first place to look if you've been with a cluster B. 30 years worth of working with clients has shown me that. Because let me put it this way, the attachment impossibility of people with BPD, let alone NPD, should be obvious, right? But the attachment impossibility with people with BPD just obliterates whatever's going on for the codependent at that point in time. Because these relationships are impossible. They cannot be repaired by by an untreated person with BPD going to couples counseling with the codependent. They can't be healed, and the relationships can't be made healthier or functional, really, if a person with BPD is untreated. And people with codependency also need to be treated. So the tossing aside by maybe some more who work more in the area of attachment with people, attachment style specifically, when somebody goes to a counselor or a therapist for relational issues that don't involve a cluster B, and you may or may not be codependent, but you go because you're recognizing that you have trouble with intimacy, that, I've had clients describe, well, when it felt like the person with BPD was really attaching to me, which they don't do, but when they were close, I kind of felt like I needed to back up. But then when they weren't there anymore, I wanted to move forward. So that's not the same as approach avoidance in BPD, but it's not totally dissimilar. It's just not as severe. So there's a lot of things for people to consider in this. And this is one reason why I would say, somebody asked me a question on my YouTube channel in a live stream recently. And they said, what do I think about being, what was the term they used? What did I think about an auto psychotherapist? And they put, good thing they described what they meant, because I didn't know what they were talking about. But in other words, what did I think about people being their own therapist? Like just people without any training or being their own therapist? Well, no. And beware of what you're reading here, there, and everywhere. Not because it doesn't have a lot of applicability and substance and correct information to it. But the people that write books like on attachment and various other things, there's nothing is coming to my mind right now. It doesn't apply when you're dealing with somebody with borderline personality or narcissistic personality. So and then when you've been traumatized, re-traumatized in these relationships, and codependency is an absolutely real thing, I would argue. And of course, not all shrinks are going to agree. Shrinks aren't going to agree with that through the APA. And maybe attachment, people that work in the area of attachment and helping people heal their attachment. But see, you can't just help somebody with BPD heal their attachment style, because a disorganized attachment style is not really an attachment style. And so people with BPD have to go through the treatment for BPD, the primal core, the treatment of the primal woundedness that arrested emotional development to where they have a lost self. It is a whole other thing than what someone might think codependency is or isn't. But to me, this sounds like a way, not consciously, not judging anyone, but for the people that have raised it recently on my YouTube channel, I'm not saying specifically only to them, but anyone who's thinking about reading more about your attachment style, germane to you, okay? Germane to your healing and recovery, but not at the beginning, all right? But not relevant whatsoever to trying to save a relationship with a borderline or a narcissist. Not relevant to thinking that that is going to be the therapy you should go get for your attachment style and the borderline's attachment style, or your attachment style and the narcissist attachment style. Because with BPD and NPD, make no mistake about it, there is no attachment. That's why they have abandonment trauma and attachment trauma, and they have arrested emotional development. BPD and NPD is not exactly the same, but the narcissistic personality is a more formidable false self, and they lack the capacity for empathy, and it's more severe, that woundedness, in many ways. And people with BPD, they also, loss of self, false self, not as formidable, not as well defended, difference between NPD and BPD. But make no mistake about it, the disorganized attachment definition is almost too generous to the borderline, untreated borderline, or the narcissist, because they have to go through an entire recovery process within the modalities specifically to treat BPD. And yes, there are some to treat some with NPD. And so that has to be done first. And then sort of like if a person heals and recovers from BPD, which I did, then yes, it was my attachment changing through all that healing and recovery work? Yes. Do I have a secure attachment style now? Basically, yes. I mean, I'm in a healthy relationship, and I'm an independent person, and I know who I am. And so I, as an independent person, I'm in a relationship with another independent person, and we form a connected relationship of mutuality, reciprocity, respect, and love through our interdependence. So that means we share much, but we don't enmesh, we don't come together as one. That is poppycock speak for codependency. Coming from a place where, I'm just going on what the commenter said right now, coming from a place where a person comments they read the book Attached, and they don't so much agree with codependency per se, or that's the person's take. But see what I'm saying here? I hope you can hear what I'm saying here. Because it will only be a re-traumatizing experience if you lead with, oh, well, maybe the problem with in the relationship with me and this borderline, untreated, is my attachment style and their attachment style. Oh no, please don't do that to yourself. Don't go there. Not recommended. You can deal with your attachment style like I said, depends how people work. But how I work is that comes along in after the working with the connectedness of the trauma bond and addiction to the borderline or narcissist, and where that goes back in family of origin, wounded inner child. After doing a lot of this kind of healing and recovery, when I work with clients, then the attachment style stuff matters, yes. But so make no mistake about it. Read a book on this, read a book on the other thing. Think about imagotherapy if you've never heard of that. It's a modality that some people have tried to drag their borderline partner into untreated. No, because imagotherapy, just for as another example, it doesn't speak to cluster B, having a partner with cluster B. It doesn't speak to the impossibility of these trauma bonded relationships at all, because it would speak more to a healthier relationship with two independent people in an interdependent healthy relationship. And if for some reason there was a breakdown in communication or something, and then the two partners in imagotherapy have to be of relatively equal mental health and have some mental health underneath their feet, so to speak, within, to be able to then do the imagotherapy work. So you can't do imago with a cluster B partner. And so to focus on your attachment style and or theirs, quote, lack of attachment style, would really be going in the wrong direction for somebody who's been with somebody with BPD, may have a BPD or NPD parent, as well as some people with codependency do, but not all. Codependency needs to be recognized more for what it really is, and many schools of thought and many different therapists in many areas of mental health who don't know, aren't expert at BPD, NPD, and these dynamics with codependency, as I am one person who is an expert in this area, more than my expertise would, I understand enough to help clients when it's time to look at attachment style after a whole lot of other work. But I'm not a specialist in the attachment styles, right? That's a whole other area. And I would say, with all due respect, the therapists in those areas are unlikely to be expert in the area that I am. And so make no mistake about it. There's a lot of things, a lot of clients bring a lot of things to me. I just can't think of them right now. Attachment styles is one. Imagotherapy, this idea of why can't we just kumbaya together somehow in some therapy process. And the reality is that BPD and NPD, some people with NPD do get treated. If they don't heal and recover totally, they can really change the way that they relate to others. This would not usually be the overt grandiose narcissist, but more the covert, sort of fragile. And vulnerable narcissist is a description, but it's not a diagnosis. So in that area between the fragile and the vulnerable, where they don't have as much grandiosity, which is a major defense in narcissistic personality disorder, and the overt narcissist has a boatload of grandiosity, and so, but the covert less so. And for the covert narcissist, the ego deflates much more quickly. And that's where we see more codependence in, like, somebody with covert narcissism. So with NPD, but covert. And so, and there's some narcissism in BPDologies. There's a whole lot of things I could say. I'm going to be going too far afield here. But the bottom line is, codependency is real. Codependency is the explanation that fits best with how and why you get into a relationship with a person with BPD or NPD. The trauma bond there, because it goes back to something in childhood. So the trauma bonded, addictive nature of how all of that unfolds, whether it's with a borderline who idealized you in the beginning, or a narcissist that love bombed you in the beginning, who you thought they were, and the whole experience of all this trauma for people who are in the relationships, not cluster B, not non-borderline, non-cluster B codependents. The codependency is huge. And the connectors to how you get into a trauma-bonded relationship with a cluster B person, back to your childhood family of origin issues and a wounded inner child in a codependent framework, are really obvious to me in the work that I do, and the work that I do successfully with clients that helps them to heal. recover, and move forward and get into healthy relationships and never look back. So make no mistake about it. People with BPD, I shouldn't even include the narcissists here, but them too. But people with BPD do not attach to you. They do not know how to love you. They do not take in your love if they are untreated. And it takes significant treatment to really change an emotional landscape so primally traumatized and wounded that it caused emotional arrested development. That means there's a lost self. This is way out of the league of, gee, what's my attachment style? So I hope that was helpful, and I hope that people can hear that I'm not trying to get into a debate about that people who've been in a relationship with a cluster B, or whatever the reason is that you need to look at yourself. If people are listening to my podcast, if they are watching videos on my YouTube channel, then likely I can safely say to you, codependency, that's the route to look at how you got to where you got, more importantly, back to family of origin, in your own therapy, wounded inner child, etc. And then we can deal with your attachment style. But the attachment style is not the biggest reason, believe it or not, why you end up in this relationship with a borderline. So I think I've said that more than once now, but I really want to emphasize it. Please don't start by denying codependency and getting into, working on your attachment style or staying with a borderline and thinking that somehow you can do that together. You're going to re-traumatize yourself. Hope that's helpful. As always, take care.
You've been listening to the Surviving BPD Relationship Breakups podcast with counselor and trauma recovery coach, AJ Mahari. Keeping it real to help you heal. Abuse is not love. You can find this podcast website with blogs and more information and purchase some book sessions with AJ Mahari at ajmahari.ca to help you with your healing and recovery journey from any relationship type with somebody with borderline personality. Please also check AJ's other website, bpdbreakups.com, for blog posts and more information. AJ's membership site can be found at ajmahari.co. Please keep tuning in, and if you're not subscribed to AJ Mahari's YouTube channel, please check it out at youtube.com/AJ Mahari.